top of the bottom hour of the show. And as promised, we are here to edutaintain. We're gonna, constantly try to be that pipeline, that voice for the community. So hit us up. IMHO Talk Show online. Any questions or comments? Because we are joined by none other than our distinguished guests to help us close out the show. Senate hopeful Sally Hudson. Sally, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule as well, because I know how these campaign times can be. And like my first, you may not know this about me, Sally, a little icebreaker for you. My first campaign that I worked on, I was living in Southern Albemarle, and I was a part of the Obama for America campaign. So 2008.
That's awesome.
Yeah, 2008. So, and I was in the Scottsville office. Now, if you can imagine, Scottsville, Virginia, and sometimes I had to close the office. It got a little sketchy down there, I must say. All my friends in Scottsville, how are you? But it is what it is. So,
about that light too.
Oh, not hearing it.
Oh no, can we turn it down a little bit?
Oh, turn it down. Oh, which one is it?
Oh, there we go.
You good? Okay,
Thank
sorry
you.
about that. Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah. So we got to remember. So Sally, my first thing for you, kind of the overview of while we're here, of course, the primary election is coming up on June 20th for all those in our listening audience. And one thing that gets said, Sally, is that the primary is more important than the general election for Charlottesville, because since Charlottesville is so heavily blue, a lot of folks feel like that who you select in this election is going to be the choice in November. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Bingo. This is a very, very safe blue seat. If you think about last fall when Josh Throneberg was running for Congress against Bob Good, he lost that race for the 5th district pretty handily by about 15 points, but he won the precincts that make up this Senate seat by 25 points. Democrats running statewide, whether for Senate or governor, they typically carry this seat by at least 20, 25, 30 points. So there really is not a credible challenge by a Republican candidate. The only declared Republican is a man by the name of Philip Hamilton. He ran against me for delegate in 2021. He lost that race 79-21.
Wow.
So that was pretty handy.
Yeah.
So he's it's not like he's raising any money. He's not an especially serious guy. The primary platform plank for him is that we ought to put the statues back up.
Wow.
So it's a real failure to read the electorate.
Wow. Yeah. Jeez. So I wanted to start off with that.
So what you're trying to say is you're the only person to vote for.
So if real deal, we're going to choose our next state senator on June 20th.
Right.
The die will be cast by then. So if you want to have a voice in the representation that we're going to have in Richmond for the next 4 years, then you got to vote on or before June 20th.
Yeah.
Now let's back up a little bit, because to me you're local. Like I feel like that you're quite indigenous, like, to our community here. But for those that don't know Sally Hudson, like, give us that brief bio for our listeners, like to kind of catch them up on who Sally Hudson is that led you to this point.
Well, I've been serving Charlottesville and Albemarle County for the last 4 years. My Charlottesville story, like a lot of people, starts at the University of Virginia. I teach economics and statistics there. And for me, that means that my call to service is rooted in trying to make it easier for working families to make ends meet. This community has soaring cost of living. It is so hard for so many people to really make a life here. And so I think, especially as a community that is very unequal, that whoever represents us has got to be deeply committed to making this a place that we can all make home. And so that's the work that I've tried to focus on in my first 4 years of public service, very focused on the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, all of the costs that we pile up in our tax code, in our justice system, the things that actually make it easier for real people to live lives.
And how would you summarize your success over the past 4 years? Of course, you have a lot of supporters, but there are also a lot of naysayers who say that you haven't necessarily worked on behalf of Black or minority community.
So very concretely, some change takes time. But if we think about housing as the number one priority that I hear from members of our community, in the new comprehensive zoning rewrite that the city council is doing right now, and that's in process, there are incentives for the construction of affordable housing in legislation that I passed that is going to ensure that going forward, all construction of new units requires reserving some units for people making less than 60% of the area median income, and will allow developers that reserve them for families making less than half of AMI to build more stories. So if you've got a building where you're going to have the units reserved for people under that income threshold, then you can add 2 stories to the building that you're going to build. So maybe you could have built a 4-story of luxury apartments, but instead you're going to build a 6-story building with a couple floors reserved for families who couldn't pay that price. And in particular, if you've got buildings where every single unit is affordable to somebody making under half of the area median income, then they can double up the number of units. So instead of having like a triple decker with luxury apartments, you can build a 6-pack and have those all be the kind of apartments that could be affordable to most people who live in the city. And so that kind of work takes time to bear fruit. I understand that doesn't mean there's a building going up across the street from somebody who's trying to pay rent right now, but the other candidate in this race has not done any meaningful work on housing like that. And so I think if that's the kind of priority for you, and it's the top priority I hear from people in this district, like you said, I don't know how you could not be working on housing and be working for this district. I've also carried bills to protect people from unlawful eviction, folks who get cut out of their apartment because they missed one payment and then suddenly find their locks changed or their heat cut off. When COVID hit and 1 in 6 Virginia workers lost their job and applied for unemployment payments, I secured about $200 million in extra relief for Virginians who weren't getting the right payments that they needed. And that's the kind of stuff that maybe not everybody sees, because not every family got stuck in that trap. But the ones who did know that that's $10,000, $15,000 in their pocket that made it possible for their family to stay afloat at a very difficult time.
But Sally, I have a request for you. Because those are great answers for someone who is campaigning. But I want you to take the campaign hat off for a second, if you can. Who is Sally Hudson? Like, what made Sally before the politics part? Because of course, like, you have strong views, so that had to come from somewhere. But for those who's curious, like, okay, like, well, where is she from? Like what's her background that may have qualified her to be a public servant?
So I grew up in a service household. My father's a minister. My mother wore all the hats in the nonprofit world. She helped serve a domestic violence shelter and taught refugees how to read. My parents instilled in me the idea that you have always got to be looking out for people who might be falling through the cracks. And for me, I think spending a lot of my childhood just banging around soup kitchens and shelters, you learn pretty quick that the folks on the inside and the folks on the outside are pretty much the same. And so there's got to be something bigger helping some people get ahead and keeping some folks stuck. And for me, it's the financial realities that are the cause of that. And so I got very interested in what's the real deal stuff that's helping some people get ahead and keeping some folks stuck. And so that's how I got really interested in finance. I went off to college, decided to study that. I majored in economics. I got to the end of college, decided I knew just enough to be dangerous, and decided to keep going, got a PhD, was hired at the University of Virginia to teach economics here. And then at that time, which was a very tumultuous time in politics between the election of Donald Trump and the summer of hate here in Charlottesville and all of the turnover in Virginia government, I think what really drew me into politics as opposed to service was coming to realize just how few people in Virginia government at the time really cared that the people that we serve understand what's going on in government. Like, I think it was my teacher side that made me want to step up and run, because I would get told all the time by the people who were representing me, like, oh, it's complicated. Like, you can't understand why that's stuck. Oh, this will take longer. Like, you don't really, and that bothers me as a teacher, because I teach classes in complicated stuff, but that doesn't mean you can't break it down in a way that anybody who cares can get their head around it. And I think I first ran in 2019 out of frustration more than anything, that I had a representative who kept telling me, you can't understand why this isn't working. I'm like, try me. I think that I can.
Okay. Gotcha.
And then if you want to do this job, you ought to be able to explain it to anybody else.
Right.
And just out of curiosity, what made you land on teaching at UVA as opposed to another higher education institution where, may have been a large population of African Americans and minorities, or low income, or what have you?
I mean, I really wanted to teach at a public institution. That was very important to me. And, I grew up in smaller communities. I wanted to serve here. I mean, you don't, when you're applying for professor jobs, you don't always get as many options as you would want. But there were a lot of things about Charlottesville that I came to love. That I moved all over growing up. I was born in Iowa, but my family moved every few years, and so I've lived on both coasts and everywhere in between, and have been blessed to call Virginia home.
Awesome. So yeah, so we're about to dig into the to the issues, the political issues and priorities with Miss Sally Hudson right about now. So thank you all for tuning in with Sir Charles and Miss Max. But before we do that, Sally, as well, a lot of folks need to know like what sets you apart from your opponent, and I say that more from like a 30,000 foot view, before going into each one, because they say, okay, well, we're like democratic, like like you both have been, like public elected officials for multiple years now, and in some capacity. So they kind of and some folks are jaded, right? Some folks say, okay, well, it's the Democratic machine. You know what I mean? It's the people have that mindset of our political system right now. Like, so what would be the first thing you would say when it comes to what sets you apart as the Democratic choice?
I think I have proven in my first 4 years of service that I am not afraid to push the pace when the Democratic machine is saying that we ought to slow down and tap the brakes. And that's been true on a host of projects that are top priorities for this community right now, whether that's protecting reproductive rights or confronting climate change. I have always been willing to say that we can't afford to hang around and wait for this to get worse. And even in times where I've had Democratic leadership in Richmond tell me, whoa, slow down. We can't really pick up on that. I mean, I was passing proactive protections for abortion access in Virginia before the Dobbs decision fell, because for me, it seemed pretty clear that reproductive rights were going south and that we had to get as much good work done on that front as we could before we potentially lost Democratic control of the General Assembly, which we did, and then lost federal protections as well. And so, I think that's the biggest difference between us, because I have a great deal of respect for Senator Deeds. For the 4 years we've been serving side by side, we've worked together well. But I do think that he has been someone who has been slower to come around on those projects. And he kind of waits till the coast is clear before he sticks his neck out. And I think that, legislators come in all stripes. But I don't think that that's the kind of senator that ought to serve in this brand new seat, because as we said at the top, this is a very, very safe blue seat. There are only a handful of them like this in all of Virginia on the state Senate map. And so if we don't get people who are willing to push out of seats like this, we just don't get them in the room.
Right. Now, another question for you too, as we dive into the particular issues, and the specificity of each one, is break it down for our listeners, like just an educational moment for those, like when they're looking at, because we also have, like delegates for the 54th to 55th districts as well that's going to be on the ballots. But with your experience, I think you could explain it very well, better than myself, of the differences, because a lot of our listeners are hearing us and they're like, okay, but how does that affect my community? Yeah. So when you look at this seat, like, try to give us the relation of the issues that Charlottesville and Albemarle are facing right now. How would you, being elected to this seat, directly help this community?
So I think it's important to understand the role that the General Assembly plays relative to your other elected officials, because I'm not running for city council and I'm not running for Congress. And so if you're not running for Congress, you're not going to declare war or run foreign policy, right? And if you're not running for city council, then you're not going to handle your trash pickup, right? So let's talk about what state government does, which is separate from the other people who are on the ballot right now. The top biggest things that your state government does that the other two don't handle are schools and healthcare, because education and Medicaid are the biggest slices of the state budget. And so I think that that's the number one thing that you ought to be looking for, is people who are working hard to support public education and to ensure that we have a strong healthcare workforce that can actually support all the patients in our community. I think that housing is a top priority for any voter in this district. But we also have to recognize that the majority of housing policy is set at the local level. That's mostly your county supervisors. That's mostly your city council, which is also on the ballot this year. There are things that state government can do to support them, like we talked about earlier. But the things that are like uniquely state government that they need us to do in a way that others can't is education and healthcare.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. I'm trying to transition with you here, but I can't help but to keep drawing a local connection. So when you talked about earlier, economics being the deciding factor in, I guess, quality of life with individuals and how you wanted to impact that, how can you then do that at a state level then without kind of doing some working locally as well? Impacting that change locally.
You absolutely have to be partners to everybody at every level of government. Anybody who's serving a state government has to be a good partner to locals, both residents and officials.
Yeah.
You got to be a good partner to your federal folks. But I'm just saying, in terms of division of duties across government, who does what? It's like your state government doesn't run the postal service. I know our mail's too slow in Charlottesville. Well, there's very little I can do about that. But if you want to talk about cost of living at the state government, really concretely, what are some things that I've done in my first 4 years that are helping it easier to help working families make ends meet? Let's talk about how that intersects with education. Up until my class was elected in 2020, public employees could not organize unions or collectively bargain for their wages. And the biggest employers in the Charlottesville-Albemarle area are all public sector, right? It's the city, it's the county, it's our local school divisions. And so our teachers, our firefighters, our city and county staff, our bus drivers, they couldn't organize for better working conditions. Just last week, our CAT bus drivers just authorized their union and are finally going to be able to organize, because up until 2020, public sector organizing was illegal in Virginia. And it took electing a bunch more people in the year that I got elected for us to finally lift that ban. There's more work to be done on that front, though, because we still have a ban on public sector collective bargaining for better working conditions for state employees. And that means in particular that if you are employed by a public state university, like the University of Virginia, you don't have bargaining rights on the job either. Yeah. So if you want to know why we don't have nurses at the UVA hospital able to organize for better working conditions, for higher pay, for better shifts, better scheduling, all of that, that runs through Richmond too, education and healthcare.
I feel like VEA kind of like found loopholes in that system, because to me, VEA is like a union of sorts.
So they exist. They are a union in the sense that they are an association. But if you can't bargain,
right.
You're not a union. You're a club.
Good point. Yeah. So you said education and healthcare, right? As far as the sort of the top two, because we can start there. Like when we think about, we just went through COVID, and people of color are still disproportionately affected, by the negative health outcomes. Like we still represent the majority of folks who seem to be negatively affected. Like within the healthcare, system, when it comes to our results on our well-being and things of that sort. Like, so how can we tackle that? Like, what can be done from the legislative level to make sure that the healthcare facilities and whatnot are being held accountable for how it treats all patients, regardless of language, ethnicity, what have you?
So I think it's worth breaking that question down into two different parts, because it's first worth asking, why were people of color contracting COVID at higher rates? And I think a lot of that has to do with working conditions, that people of color were disproportionately serving the frontline jobs in retail and hospitality that were so exposed to COVID. And I think a lot of why they didn't have the ability to have safer, healthier working conditions is, again, it goes back to workers' rights. I mean, labor rights have been so hollowed out in Virginia, and that's why we had so many people that were working either for public employees or grocery store workers, all of it.
Tell me, just give me an example, maybe, of what you mean by workers' rights.
Oh, I mean, like the right to bargain for whatever it is you want on the job, whether that is your compensation, your sick leave policy. So, like we don't have paid sick leave requirements in Virginia. And that's a big factor in whether or not, if somebody contracts the virus, if they can afford to stay home, or if they feel pressure to go to work because they know that they're not going to be able to make rent that month if they don't. I mean, if you think it really concretely, how does somebody get sick when they should be staying home and taking care of themselves? That's a great example. And we were working really hard during COVID, but this is where I think there's a huge culture gap right now between the members of the House and the members of the Senate. The members of the House, way more diverse, way more people with firsthand experience navigating these challenges, who are pushing so much harder for strong paid sick leave protections, especially for frontline workers in retail and hospitality. And those proposals got killed in the Senate. I mean, like, really concretely, I'm an economist by trade. The Senate Commerce Committee is the committee where most of the biggest projects that I would care about, that would touch most people's financial lives, go to die. And that's because that committee has 15 members, 14 men, and no economists. It's a bunch of mostly retired, affluent white guys. There's one woman in the room when it comes time for us to talk about how the workforce works. Should we be super surprised that we don't have paid sick leave and paid family leave in Virginia if there's nobody around to say?
Do they offer any response or feedback as to why that particular bill died?
Oh, I mean, it's a hardship on businesses, right? I mean, the interests of business owners are better represented in that room than the interests of workers.
Right.
So, like, again, really concrete example, that bill that I told you about that now makes it possible for all of our teachers and our first responders and our bus drivers to bargain for better working conditions. The version that we passed in the House would have required every locality to negotiate with a union if the local workers wanted to form one. The only bill that we could get through the Senate made it an option for the local governments. So in Charlottesville and Albemarle, it's a good thing that our local governments were willing to engage in that. But there's only about 10 localities in all of Virginia that have local governments that are. So that means the vast majority of Virginia workers still live in a community where their local city council, their local county board is saying, no, we're not doing that. And
how do you plan on shaking all that up? How are you hoping to?
Well, I'm running for the Senate right now because I think we're trying to get some more serious people in the Senate because they're the bottleneck. Like, that's my belief is that you got to attack the problem where it's actually stuck. And where so many of the projects that I care about are actually stuck is because the Senate has not gotten nearly as diverse as the House. In the last 6 years, since Donald Trump was elected president, fully half the House has turned over. And we have grown more diverse on every possible dimension, and not just the classic demographic markers like race and gender, though that has happened. We now have the first majority woman caucus in Virginia history. We've broken so many barriers on race and ethnicity and faith, all of that. But most importantly, from my perspective, is that we've elected a much wider range of professional backgrounds in the room. Like, instead of having everybody be affluent, retired, or attorneys, the House caucus now has a high school civics teacher and a nurse practitioner, 2 social workers, a former journalist, an environmental planner. It's got an economist. I think there should be one of us in the room when we're counting money. But we've got a whole bunch more perspectives around the room, and that hasn't happened yet in the Senate, and you can tell. Like, when you hear us talk about brass tax stuff, like, how is this bus going to get to A to B in a way that lets working families get their kids to school on time? That's when you see it most.
Yeah. And I heard you, mention how people of color are at a higher proportion, sort of pre-exposed, to things like COVID, from the type of workforce that feels that for the majority. But I think a little deeper about it, like that I would like to get, like some of your ideas about, which is when people of color go to their healthcare providers, a lot of times people who speak Spanish as first language, like, can't communicate. And I've heard the horror stories of, like, billing. I was actually on UVA's billing advisory committee, and like things as simple as that, to where you don't properly communicate, and people get bills they don't understand. They get billed for things they didn't know they were getting billed for. So I'm thinking about more logistical things. And then also, we've even had healthcare professionals say that they're actually taught that, like, Black women can withstand more pain than white women. So then they treat them that way when they're in their facilities, right? Like, so I'm thinking of that level, like what can be done, because I know there's like state boards and things of that sort that make a lot of these determinations. So I'll get your thoughts on that first, and then we'll go into more of the insurance part.
Yeah, I appreciate you circling back on that, because when I was breaking it down earlier, I was focused first on who's getting sick more, but then what do we do when folks show up in a hospital? When you were on that billing committee, was that a response to all the news that broke
Yes.
about the debt collection.
Yes.
So really concretely, I carried a bill that is now law in Virginia that now makes that kind of predatory medical debt collection illegal at every hospital statewide. So you can no longer seize somebody's car or their home just because they're behind on their medical bills. Because when people get sick and they are released, their first priority has to be healing. It cannot be trying to make up the whole
Right.
of the debt that they just got. So as part of that bill, that was a bill that I carried jointly with a delegate by the name of Kathy Tran, who's from the Fairfax area. She herself is a Vietnamese refugee. She got brought as a child to the family. She's very, very attentive to language access issues, of what you're just describing. And part of that law, the biggest part that she worked on, one of her top priorities, was about setting new standards that all of the hospitals now have to implement that will require them to measure the frequency of languages in their patient service territory and to make all of those forms and interpreters available to all of the languages over a certain threshold of the population. I mean, in this community where there are hundreds of different languages spoken, it's always going to be challenging to have every single one, and the state kind of has to step in there to make those resources. But that's concretely, that's a great example of the kind of stuff that gets better when the body gets more diverse. Because nobody has worked harder on language access issues than Delegate Tran.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I was thinking yes, as far as the educational piece as well, like I know that's sort of a deep dive, but we can connect that to the insurance, like you also, studying business and knowing the economy. Like one big excuse that I seem to constantly hear is excuse and argument rather, between folks saying that our healthcare system is messed up because on one hand, you're going to be charging employers too much, but then I feel like on the other side, there's always the insurance company there that somehow eventually gets left out of the conversation. Like, so I'm curious your thoughts on what can be done when it comes to me, in my opinion, what seems to be sort of a stranglehold that private insurance companies have on our healthcare system. And then of course the people are negatively impacted because it seems like that either we the citizen or maybe a small business owner that catches the brunt of it. You see things like Affordable Health Care Act, like it's hard to get pushed through or gets retracted because, again, in my opinion, the insurance companies aren't being held accountable.
Yeah. I mean, I think from the small business owner's perspective, I don't know anybody who goes into business and also wants to run a healthcare consulting effort on the side. They're like, you started a radio show, you started a bakery or whatever, and you want to do right by your employers, but the headache of trying to figure out how to handle all of their benefits is not what you signed up to do. And so I talk to a lot of small business owners who would love to see the state make more good but simple options available so that didn't have to be one more thing on their plate as an entrepreneur. I think most concretely, the thing that we could be doing at the state level is to become a state that has what's called a Medicaid buy-in, which basically says that anybody can buy into the Medicaid system at a rate that is prorated to their income. So if you're somebody who is still low income, that could still be free insurance that is available to you. But you can have a sliding scale on the way up so that if you're somebody who's, somewhere in between, but you can still get that insurance coverage. And if the government is providing that backstop that is always available and funding it appropriately, that would take that headache off of and always ensure that there was another outside option to hold the insurance companies accountable, because then only if they're providing plans on the state exchange that are competitive with the kind of coverage that you could buy into from the state, then they'd stay in business.
Right.
But I think the problem is right now is that they don't face competition from a credible alternative. And I think that the Medicaid system, which already serves an extraordinary share of Virginians, is best suited to be that accountability device.
I think I think we have a lot of listeners who, when they think about healthcare, they just want to be able to have access. I want to be able to go to the doctor or the hospital. I don't want to have to use the emergency department as my PCP. I want to feel like my doctors see me and understand what I'm talking about or listening to me. I want to get good health care, and I don't want to feel like the type of care that I get or how I'm treated by my doctors and nurses or what have you is in some way connected to the fact that I either don't have insurance or I have Medicaid. Because there is a difference in how I've experienced the difference in how you're treated when you have Medicaid and when you have, I guess, commercial insurance. And then, they just want to be able to live a long, healthy life. And so I wonder, I worry that for a lot of the listeners, we're just kind of going over their head right now.
Yeah.
I just want to know, speaking for them, I just want to know, Sally, how can you make sure that when I go to the doctor, I have access, I'm going to get good treatment, they're going to give me good advice and not good diagnosis, sound diagnosis, and not treat me based on the way that I look or the way I talk or the color of my skin, and that if need be, I can follow back up, get my medication, get this and get that. How can you help me do that? Because all of this other stuff, and I'm just talking from the perspective of my community, all that other stuff don't matter to me. Tell me how I just get good health care.
So
How can you help ensure that?
So we talked about part of it, right? Which is
Right.
how do you pay for it?
Mhm.
Like we can pretend like we don't have to figure out how to pay for it, right? But we got to address those brass tacks.
That's true, but
But the question is, I think what you're saying is, how do we get more providers that are going to treat people well in the room? Because at the end of the day, you cannot legislate that. I do not believe that we could have some kind of mandatory DEI training that's suddenly going to make people treat people well who haven't figured out how to do that by the time they hit adulthood.
Right.
I don't think that there's some kind of sticks and carrots system. Like you could build some kind of terrible system of penalties for people who treat people poorly. But so, I think most institutions start treating people better when the people who drive them look more like the people that they serve. And so I think the only long-term solution to that is getting more people of color into the leadership ranks of our hospitals and our healthcare providers, because they're the ones who are going to continue to develop, hire, train, and promote providers who meet their standards. And so the question is, how can I, from the perch of a legislator, and I don't pretend like we're all powerful, what can we do to be part of that team? I think one of the really concrete things that we can do is make it easier for students of color to go into healthcare by helping cut the cost of college and training, because it takes a long time to become a doctor or a nurse practitioner, and it costs a lot of money. And we have to, in particular, help them get rid of the debt that comes on the other side of that when they're serving diverse communities, because we have such a shortage of qualified providers there. So I think less about how do you try to write laws that control people's behavior, and more about how do you get the right people in the room. And so I try to think about that. And then, to the extent that we can punish bad behavior, which we have to when we do, I think it's long past time that the kind of support that we give our state hospitals in particular depends on them meeting quality patient markers of how they're treating patients. Because we can't, if we look at, just the gaps in maternal mortality alone, which ought to be a solved problem in 2023, like how do we keep somebody alive when they're giving birth? Like that has got to be before anybody calls themselves a top hospital and gets rewarded for that. They have to be meeting basic standards on keeping people alive for the things they do every day.
Yeah, and that I think that feeds into, actually, well, I didn't want to skip over this, Max. We talking about health, and did we want to dive into the reproductive rights at all? Any thoughts on that? Or any
Yes,
questions? And you see how I yielded, because I'm the man in the room, so I'm like, y'all want to talk about it?
Right. The only thing I'll say, and I'll let Sally respond to that question, but the only thing I want to say is that as a female, I don't want other people making my decisions for me, and I especially don't want to be a pawn in someone's come to Jesus. I'm gonna be ethical when it comes to deciding abortion rights and different things like that, and we're gonna do the right thing, and God says that we shouldn't have abortion, so we're not going to have abortion, but then we're making all these horrible decisions on the other end. Like, I don't want to be a pawn in all of that. Not speaking about my beliefs one way or another, but I don't agree with that. So I'll leave it at that. How do you respond to Charles's question?
So I think that reproductive rights is one of the big differences between the candidates in this race. Both of us would tell you that we're pro-choice, but only one of us has ever actually done work on protecting reproductive rights. Senator Deeds has been in elected office longer than I've been alive. In my entire lifetime, he has never introduced a bill about reproductive rights. And he'll tell you the exact same thing that you said, which is he didn't think it's my place because he's a man. But that does mean that you have to let women go to work when it's time to do that work. And I've been a very proactive legislator on reproductive rights. Let me give you a really concrete example. I know I'm being nerdy about the health insurance stuff, but this is where the rubber meets the road. Just a few short years ago in Virginia, it was illegal for people to use the health insurance plans that they were buying through Obamacare to cover abortion. That meant that if you were a woman who was bleeding out with a miscarriage at the UVA ER, that you would have the doctor tell you, you're also going to have to cover this out of pocket, tens of thousands of dollars. And I need to do this right now or you're going to lose your life. Can you do that? It was illegal. I one of the very first bills that I filed as a freshman legislator was a bill to get rid of that ban because I knew women who had to face that decision. And I faced a lot of pushback from people, even Democrats in Richmond, who said, I don't think we really want to talk about who pays for abortion. Like, if you want to make that decision on your own, that's fine. But I don't think we're really ready to talk about the realities of it. And I was like, well, what the hell does it matter what your rights say if you can't actually afford to get the treatment when you need it? And I think that's what it means when abortion for a lot of people is a political talking point, but not actually a healthcare reality. Like, it's not a thing you might need someday. So I think that I know what it's like to actually do that work in a way that touches real people's lives. And since passing that bill, and had a lot of women contact me and tell me about their experience and how hard that was. And so I do really think that it is important at a time when abortion rights are under attack, that we recognize that women can fight for our rights on our own terms. We don't need a few good men to do it for us. And we will always fight harder than somebody who knows they'll never need one.
Yeah. That's deep. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, we are joined by Senate hopeful Sally Hudson right now. And the other piece that we had talked about, I mean, there's, of course, there's a lot. And I know you mentioned education and health sort of being top tier, as far as what has a local effect, what has the most local impact. But I gotta bring up the gun violence and injustice stuff. I have to. I'd be remiss if I didn't, before going to maybe closing on the education. But particularly because our community has seen such a spike in it. And so whatever may be attributed to, there's a lot of different opinions on that and whatnot. But the criminal justice system, while there has been improvements, I think it's obviously, it's obvious which communities still is the most is the most affected by the criminal justice and seems to disproportionately be incarcerated or be arrested or whatever the case is. So just some of your ideas around the fixes of sort of that criminal justice sort of framework, and then we can maybe get into the specifics of gun violence after that. But I'm curious about some of the criminal justice reform that you would like to see happen.
I think I feel the same way about criminal justice reform that I do about protecting reproductive rights, which is that no one will fight harder and smarter than the people who are directly affected. And so, as someone who has not personally been much directly affected by the justice system, I try as much as possible to do the criminal justice work that I do with people who have. For me, the work that I've done thus far has again been mostly focused on the financial consequences of getting incarcerated. I've done a lot of work with the Fountain Fund on how do we help people who have been incarcerated and released get rid of the burden of court debt, which traps so many people when they should be getting on their feet and securing housing and employment and healthcare. I'm really passionate about getting rid of barrier crimes, which prevent people from getting jobs that they're wholly qualified to do. I mean, I teamed up with a Republican colleague this year on a little bitty bill that we finally got passed, which tells you how far behind we are in Virginia. Up until this bill, which is going to become law in July, it was illegal for somebody who had a possession charge of their own to serve as a peer recovery specialist for addiction. And so you've got the person who is most uniquely qualified to help somebody else who is struggling with addiction is disqualified from holding the position. Barrier crimes in Virginia keep so many people from doing work that they are not just qualified, but the best person to do. So that's the places where I've been most active. But I think so there's so much work to be done at every possible stage of the pipeline, because we know that at every decision point in the justice system, people of color face worse outcomes, whether that is like contact with police, arrests, the charges are more severe, right? They're more likely to get convicted, they get stiffer sentences. Like once they are convicted, they end up in worse facilities. They're treated less well by the opportunities for releasing good behavior. So, I think, if I think about concretely, what's the biggest thing that I have done to put Virginia in a place to really reckon with that? Last spring, I was a big part of helping us replace the leader of the House Democratic Caucus, and we elected with our work a man by the name of Don Scott, who is from Portsmouth, who himself is formerly incarcerated. And he has been, I think, the strongest advocate for serious criminal justice reform in Virginia. And he's now on his way to be the first Black Speaker of the House if we take this back. And so I think, like, when I think about who do I look to for the projects that I want to be a partner on, it's folks locally who have been involved with the justice system, and then again elevating people with that real experience into leadership roles so that they can steer the show.
Yeah, and Max, like, there's so many intricacies in what she said, because I was thinking of different stories as you were talking, Sally, and like I think about even how someone is released and they come home, but they came from an environment, right, like that led to a life of crime. So then there's certain laws in place to where like an ex-felon can't live with someone who has a felony, and like there's different things like that, and like I don't know the whole definition of the law, but I know people who ran into that. And then their other option was be homeless, because everybody that I know had something on their record. So my only option, so there's just intricacies like that where, and I think about folks like legal aid justice that pay attention to those intricacies. So
but if I could just piggyback on that, I don't know if you're moving on to your next.
Well, I'm just going to say, like, are you a proponent of trying to get funding to those local groups like that's doing the work in these communities?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think just this last week, actually, we did a great forum with People's Coalition, Legal Aid Justice Center, and FAR. And that was, I think, those to me are some of the deepest partners in my work in Richmond. Because again, I think our general motto for policymaking ought to be nothing about you without you, like always. And that in that means you've got to be a good partner to all of the folks who are steering that local level work here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as I'm listening to your priorities in terms of workers' rights and education, things like that, crime and things like that, a lot of the things that Black and minority people deal with is very cyclical, right? So you have a kid who is raised in a home whose parents don't deal with issues with workers' rights and don't make a high income. And so, hold on, sorry, I'm trying to just get my words together here. But whose parents don't make that much money. And so they deal with the issues in the home, and then they go to school, and there's issues there because of the home environment. And then these kids potentially fall into a situation where they're involved, get in trouble with the law, so they're dealing with issues there, and then so on and so forth. So it's a continual situation where the family themselves, and it could go on for generations and generations, can't find their way to get out of that cycle. But if there's different touch points where we can, one degree off would change the outcome, would make a huge difference. And when it comes to being able to access insurance, being able to have healthcare insurance and getting the help that the parents may need or the children themselves may need. And I'm thinking about something like mental health in terms of that, or being able to, if they find themselves getting in trouble, having the option of alternative sentencing or something else that keeps them from really getting involved in the criminal justice system and possibly jail time and things like that. It avoids what could happen down the road. So I am putting together different touch points as far as what your priorities could really change for families.
I think that's right, because I think that the reality is that people who grow up with money make mistakes too. It's just easier for them to buy their way out, right? I mean, like, because they get themselves out of a jam because they can afford to, I don't want to say buy their way out. It's not like they're bribing people, but it just, the world is more forgiving when you got cushion.
They have opportunities.
Right.
They have options.
Yeah. That's definitely spot on. Thank you for this conversation thus far. So like within that same justice realm, we talk about gun violence. Like my question is straightforward and simple. Why can't we get serious about gun registration and like serious about there being a database kept? Because and before you make your point, like the more that I see and the more that I learn, and the more gun violence that happens, I am more and more wholeheartedly in that just the simple fact of tracing registrations and having, like more control over how firearms are obtained would solve so many issues. And I'm not even speaking from it as like being against NRA or being against like gun owner rights. It's nothing like that at all. Well, not really. Yeah, but I'm not against it at all. What I'm against is the fact that we're not serious about tracking, because again, in my opinion, Max and Sally, like I feel like that once you do that, then you're cutting off the people who are getting firearms into the wrong hands. And I feel like that there possibly could be powers that be that benefit from firearms being in the wrong hands as to why we haven't solved this yet. But curious your thoughts about that.
I appreciate you bringing it up because I think you hit it right on the head. Because without a serious system of tracking, all the other gun laws that we have don't really matter. I mean, in theory, you can't possess a firearm in Virginia if you've got past convictions for domestic violence, or if you've got past convictions for hate crime, like if you've committed like assault or stalking on the basis of somebody's race or their gender, like you hurt somebody, it's not legal for you to own a firearm in Virginia anymore. But there's no tracking system that tells us that you've got one.
Right.
And there's no system that requires you to show up and turn it over. And so it might as well be like, it's just in theory, but in practice, we know that those guns are still out there. And so many of our other gun laws that politicians like to pat themselves on the back for passing don't have real impact because we don't have a system for tracking and enforcing. I think that's real.
I think what brings it home to me is that when we have these mass shootings at schools or wherever, and you still have organizations like the NRA, or you have your political officials or whomever still supporting the gun laws as they are, gun rights as they are. Like, it's like, this is never going to change. This is literally never going to change. People are dying. Someone close to you could be dying, and you still don't want to change these laws.
Yeah,
I'm not hopeful.
Yeah, and to Max's point, that's what I get back to, the accountability, because you can look at it like for guns that are used, like that are obtained illegally, but also think about the accountability as well when it comes to those who like take a school shooting, for instance. Like I feel like there has to, then that level of accountability then has to be on the parent, the guardian, or whoever. So to me, it's still about who owns this firearm, who was reckless with this firearm for it to get into this person's hands, that then took it to school and killed multiple children. So it's still about that accountability. Why are we not serious about it?
So are y'all going to talk to Senator Deeds? Is he going to come in and do this?
Yes.
Okay. So I think you should ask him questions about all of those, because if you want to know concretely what's the biggest difference in our voting records over the last many years, it's on guns and on every single topic that we've just touched. You want to know why we have so many illegal firearms on our streets? It's because Senator Deeds was one of 2 Democrats who crossed party lines and repealed Virginia's ban on buying more than 1 handgun a month, which is why Virginia has been a top state for illegal gun trafficking. You get the one guy who can pass a background check to go buy a fistful of weapons and then pass them out to the people who couldn't get through it. You want to talk about holding parents accountable? When in my first term in 2020, he was again one of 2 Democrats who voted down a bill that would have held the grown-ups accountable if a minor gets a hold of a weapon that they have left recklessly abandoned and hurt somebody. And he was one of 4 Senate Democrats who voted down the assault weapons ban when we had a chance to pass it under Governor Northam.
And I guess this is also a reason why we got to get out and vote, right, Silas? Because I would say that Senator Deeds is in place because somebody wants him in place. because they can get away with doing things like this. And so I would say it's also going to be pretty difficult to maybe displace him because they want to continue the status quo. They don't want things to change. And so the only individuals that can really impact that are citizens, our voters.
And if I can hit on this, because I think there's a piece that's happening in this election that is not on everybody's radar, which is that the seats that we're running for this year, you keep hearing all these numbers like Senate District 11 and House District 55. What's special about these elections in 2023 is that these are the first districts in Virginia history that were not drawn by the sitting politicians. We ended the practice called gerrymandering that lets politicians draw their own district lines. And we finally handed that over to a couple independent court-appointed map makers, folks who aren't involved with politics at all. And they drew new seats. And the rules that they had to follow was they had to keep communities together. And so now our new districts keep Charlottesville whole, they keep Charlottesville and Albemarle together. And that's why we've got this election going on, is that Senator Deeds used to serve in a seat that he had been part of drawing that ran all the way from Charlottesville City over the Blue Ridge to Bath County, which is where he has always served. It's almost 2 hours away. And this was the first election where he didn't get to draw his own seat. And Bath County and Charlottesville weren't drawn together anymore because Bath and Charlottesville don't have a lot in common. And so now we've got a new seat that is all of Charlottesville and Albemarle together. And he moved here to run in that election. And so that's, if you want to know, hey, like, why does it feel like I've got two Democrats running in this race against each other? I thought Sally was in the House. I thought Cree was in the Senate. It's because we've got a new seat, and I call me old fashioned, but I think people should run and serve where they live.
Good point. And we only have a minute left, but just the education, if there's anything Max had to ask where you want to touch on education, like my main thing is, Sally, like I hope we can treat our educators more like the heroes that they are. And when I say that, I'm talking about being fair in their benefits and in their pay, because they are professionals, the lowest paid professionals, people who got to get a professional level degree. And then we pay them what we pay. So, like, I would ask that of you, or maybe ways that you may go about that. And then also being honest with our kids. All the talk about CRT, and of course, like, you may have a governor that's going to be hard to get things, approved through. But it's, like being honest with our children and respectful of our teachers. But anything you want to add on education?
And another thought I have is for me, education has the idea of education has broadened some. Because I don't view it solely as academics. Our kids need so much more than just to be taught history or math. They're dealing with mental health issues and different things like that. So I guess I'm looking at it as a more holistic issue in terms of what the schools or the education system needs.
All of the above. And that's a huge place where we need the state to start stepping up and investing more in our schools. And I think there's a huge connection between those, because if you hop on my website, you'll see a bunch more detailed plans for education. But we have not just been systematically underfunding our classroom teachers, but also all those critical support staff, the counselors, the social workers, everybody. And so the teachers that we have left feel like they're wearing too many hats. I don't know anybody who works in a school right now who I talk to who doesn't say, I feel like I'm doing 2 or 3 jobs for the price of one. And that's why we have to invest in all the above, so that these incredible professionals have the time and the space and the resources to do their part of the work well. And we're not asking every one of them to be so stretched thin.
What's your theory about that? Why do we pay teachers so little?
Because they're women. Real talk.
That's real talk.
Because they're women, and because if look at any profession that is systematically women, teachers, nurses, all of that. In fact, if you look at the history of compensation for teachers in the country, it used to be back in about 100 years ago that teaching was still a majority male job, and then as it started to open up to women, suddenly we didn't keep paying them like professionals anymore.
Sally, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. I appreciate the conversation. That's the thing about our platform here. People want just sit down, honest, not stump speeches, but just honest conversation. So we appreciate you taking the time to do that.
I appreciate the very real questions. They're exactly the ones that we ought to be answering.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, folks, you've been tuned into In My Humble Opinions, bottom of the show. Believing you guys take care of each other as usual. Thanks for supporting us and tuning in. We'll be back with another live show in a couple of weeks. But in the meantime, stay safe.
And remember, June 20th, vote.
That's right.
In the primaries.
Thank you for joining us, Al.
Thank you.